Welcome to the deep dive. If you just look around Western culture today, it's hard to miss this real preoccupation, almost an obsession with sex, gender, identity.
Hmm.
And you have to wonder, why have things like sexual orientation become such a central test for, whether someone belongs or is recognized in society? It wasn't always like this, was it? Say 50, 100 years ago.
No, it really wasn't. And I think if we only look at it through the lens of today's politics, we kind of miss the deeper story.
Right.
So our mission today is to, well, dig deeper, go beyond the day-to-day culture war stuff. We're going to use the work of three really insightful thinkers, Philip Rieff, Charles Taylor, and Alistair McIntyre, to try and understand let's call them the structural issues, the sort of faulty wiring underneath it all that led us here.
Okay, faulty wiring, I like that. So let's start digging. Where do we begin? Maybe with this idea that seems foundational,
Right.
the social imaginary. We probably need to get our heads around that first.
Yeah, absolutely. Think of the social imaginary as like the background operating system for a culture. It's not really formal philosophy people study. It's more the intuitive stuff, the gut feeling about how the world is.
Uh-huh.
It's the set of assumptions we don't even question that shapes how we think, how we act, and crucially, how we understand belonging and recognition. It's the water we swim in.
So if that operating system changes drastically, or maybe crashes, or the basic code gets rewritten, then the whole way we think about morality, how we see each other, that would fundamentally shift too.
Exactly. The ground moves beneath our feet.
It moves from something maybe external and solid to something more internal, subjective.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
And Philip Rieff gives us a kind of historical map for understanding this huge shift.
Mhm.
He categorizes cultures, but not based on geography or economics.
Okay.
No, he looks at how they justify their moral codes, their rules, their prohibitions, what he calls interdicts.
Interdicts. Right. Reef argues that you can't even have a culture without agreeing on what you don't do. Prohibitions are key.
They're absolutely key. He talks about these first and second worlds, historically successful models, and the difference is where they place their cultural anchor.
The anchor. So the first world.
Those are the pagan, the mythic cultures. Think ancient Greece or Rome. Their moral codes, their laws, they were rooted in something seen as transcendent, like fate or myths. The example of like Kyrgyz in Sparta, his laws supposedly got their authority from the oracle at Delphi. The power source was outside the human arrangement itself.
Okay, makes sense. And the second worlds, that would be the major religions like Christianity.
That's right, the great monotheistic faiths.
Yeah.
Here, stability comes from the perceived will of the transcendent God. Laws come from revelation. People swear oaths on sacred texts. Courts used to have a Bible present.
Yeah.
In both these models, first and second worlds, the culture feels stable because it sees itself as reflecting a sacred order, something bigger than itself. It doesn't need to justify itself just on its own terms, which Reef thought was impossible anyway.
But then we arrive at, well, us, the modern West, Reef's third world. What happens when you cut that anchor loose? What does he call this new situation?
He calls it the anti-foundation.
Yeah.
It's a dramatic term. But his point is, when you reject the sacred, when there's no transcendent source for rules, well, then morality has to try and justify itself based only on itself.
And that doesn't work.
Reef argued it can't, not in the long run.
Yeah.
The culture loses its power to enforce its own rules because there's no ultimate authority backing them up. The result? Constant change, instability, everything's up for grabs.
Okay. And Charles Taylor, he comes in here with a related idea, doesn't he? This immanent frame.
Exactly. Taylor provides this brilliant description of the mental space, the cultural enclosure that allows this loss of the sacred to happen. He talks about the immanent frame.
Immanent meaning. Just here. This world.
Precisely. Before, the background assumption was transcendent for it, God eternity, a bigger reality.
Right.
Order came from providence, God's plan. But slowly, especially with the Enlightenment, the frame shifts. This material world is seen as all there is.
So the blueprint for order changes.
Yeah. It shifts from God's divine plan to something like nature, seen as a kind of self-running system. And suddenly, God starts to look like, well, an extra hypothesis. You don't really need to explain how society works or where morality comes from.
The focus shifts from, say, serving God or a higher purpose to just managing this world, making things work efficiently here and now.
That's a big part of it. And we can see the huge impact of this shift if we look at a really contentious issue, like abortion. How does that debate change between a second world and a third world perspective? It's a stark contrast. In the second world, grounded in faith, the arguments were still fundamentally metaphysical. People disagreed, sure, But the disagreement was about when exactly the embryo gets a soul or reflects the image of God.
Right, like Aquinas debating 40 or 90 days.
Exactly. The criteria were debated, but they were always sacred, transcendent criteria.
But in the third world, once you remove that transcendent dimension,
Mm.
what happens to the idea of personhood? It becomes contested, arbitrary
Yeah,
almost.
that's the word. Arbitrary. Because the things we usually associate with being a person, like self-awareness, thinking, existing independently, an embryo doesn't have those, right?
Right.
So that creates a vacuum. And what fills it? The values of our modern culture, what Reef called the therapeutic culture. The criteria shift away from the metaphysical,
Yeah.
the soul, and towards subjective things, pragmatic things,
Like,
like the mother's well-being, her psychological health, her self-fulfillment, her happiness. The central question stops being about the fetus's sacred status and becomes about the adult's subjective experience.
wow. So the moral weight shifts entirely from protecting something seen as sacred life to preserving individual feeling, psychological state.
Pretty much. Ethics starts to look like a function of feeling, of psychological well-being, and that leads us straight into the work of Alasdair MacIntyre.
Right, MacIntyre. He connects the chaos, the shouting matches in modern ethics directly to losing something else. Teleology, that sounds a bit academic.
It does, but it's crucial. Telos is just Greek for end or purpose. MacIntyre's point is basically that we as a society have stopped agreeing on what human life is for. What's our goal? What's the point?
Okay.
And he argues that morality needs shared traditions, community agreement. But if we don't agree on the ends we're aiming for, well then our moral language just breaks down into noise. It stops making sense.
And what fills that gap, according to MacIntyre?
What fills the vacuum is what he calls emotivism. This is his core diagnosis of our situation.
Emotivism, let's define that carefully, because it's about how language is used, not just what words mean, right?
Exactly right. Emotivism is the idea that when we make moral judgments, say, that's wrong, or this is good, we're actually just expressing our feelings, our preferences, our attitudes. MacIntyre says they are, quote, nothing but expressions of preference, expressions of attitude or feeling.
Okay, but we don't say, I feel that this is wrong. We say this is wrong.
Precisely. That's the key. We present our personal preferences as if they were objective truths that should apply to everyone.
So if I say, I don't know, capital punishment is barbaric. An emotivist analysis suggests what people actually hear or how it functions is more like, I personally hate capital punishment and you should too. It sort of drains the objective force out of it.
It drains the claim of universal validity, yes. And you can see how this messes with institutions. Think about the arguments over marriage, say, same-sex marriage versus traditional views.
Okay.
The disagreement isn't just about who can get married. It's a much deeper disagreement about the purpose, the telos, of marriage itself.
So traditionally, one of the core purposes was seen as procreation, which meant an opposite-sex couple was necessary for that end.
Right. So if you argue that marriage should include same-sex couples, you are, in effect, arguing that procreation isn't a necessary end for marriage. You're redefining the institution by changing its assumed purpose.
And the arguments often just talk past each other because they start from different assumptions about the purpose.
Exactly. And you see the rhetorical tactics that emerge from this.
Huh.
Think about how often in public debates, someone who holds a more traditional view, something out of step with the current therapeutic consensus,
Yeah.
they get dismissed with labels ending in morophobia.
Like homophobia or transphobia?
Yes. MacIntyre would see that as weaponized emotivism,
How so?
because labeling someone's view a phobia frames it immediately as an irrational fear. It's just a personal, emotional hang-up, neurotic bigotry maybe.
So it implies there's no need to actually engage with the reasons or the arguments behind their position, because it's just based on irrational feelings anyway.
That's how it functions rhetorically. It's a shortcut.
Yeah.
It reinforces the underlying emotivist idea that the only valid viewpoints are those aligned with maximizing individual happiness and psychological well-being, and anything else is just prejudice.
Okay, I see the connection now. MacIntyre's emotivism, this focus on feeling,
Yeah.
it links up with Taylor's idea of expressive individualism, the need to express my inner self.
It really does.
And both of those seem to operate within what Reef called the therapeutic third world culture, where my personal happiness is the ultimate goal.
You've got it. The three thinkers really do paint a coherent, if maybe troubling, picture. If the self, my inner feelings, my happiness, become the ultimate moral authority.
Then all those older external authorities, tradition, religion, community rules that asked for sacrifice are told you no, They have to be challenged or even removed.
Exactly. Which brings us to maybe Reef's most provocative idea,
Yeah.
the anti-culture.
Anti-culture. Not just a new culture, but against culture.
That's his argument. He says the third world isn't just another phase of culture. It operates as an anti-culture.
Mm.
Its driving force, especially among cultural elites, isn't about preserving and passing down the traditions, the sacred order.
It's about
It's about actively subverting it, destabilizing it, taking it apart. The elites become deliberate iconoclasts, breakers of images, breakers of traditions.
But wait a second, aren't cultures always changing? Don't healthy cultures criticize themselves? How is this anti-culture different from just reform?
That's a fair question. The difference Reef points to is the anchor. A reforming culture might criticize how well it's living up to its sacred rules, its core values. It wants to improve its connection to the anchor.
Okay.
The anti-culture critiques the rules themselves. It critiques the anchor. It aims not for reform, but for erasure. And this often shows up as a deep suspicion of history, a rejection of the past as a source of wisdom. C.S. Lewis had a great term for it, chronological snobbery.
The idea that just because we live now, we must be smarter or better than people in the past.
Yeah, and this gets fueled by a couple of things. One is just, technology and consumerism. They always point us towards the next new thing, making the past seem outdated, maybe even embarrassing.
Old phone, old ideas.
And there are philosophical roots, too.
Yeah.
Think about certain interpretations of Marx, for example, where history is basically just a long, grim story of oppression, class struggle.
Uh-huh.
If that's your view, then the past isn't a source of wisdom to learn from. It's mainly a catalog of victims and victimizers, something to overcome, not cherish.
Okay, so the anti-culture wants to dismantle the past. How does it do it? What's the mechanism? This is where Reef talks about death works.
Yeah, if death works. A death work for Reef is like a targeted attack, an all-out assault upon something vital to the established culture.
How does it assault it?
By changing how we feel about things,
Oh.
changing our aesthetic tastes, making the old rules, the old values look silly or ugly or just irrelevant. It aims to make the old ways of living feel unlivable. It subverts the authority behind them.
And he gives some pretty vivid examples, doesn't he? Like the Serrano artwork. Piss Christ.
Yeah, that's a really potent example for Reef. It's a death work aimed squarely at the Second World's foundation.
Because it takes the central sacred symbol, the crucifix.
And literally submerges it in the artist's urine.
Yeah.
Makes it excremental. It doesn't try to argue logically against Christianity. It bypasses argument and just makes the sacred symbol look vile.
Yeah.
Disgusting. It attacks the authority of the sacred by profaning the symbol.
But it's not always that graphic, is it? Death
Yeah.
works can be more subtle.
Oh, absolutely. They can be corrosive rather than explosive. Things like irony, cynicism, satire. He might put to someone like T.S. Eliot, whose poetry often undercut the big romantic search for meaning by focusing on, bleak, clinical, mundane details.
Sort of deflating the search for transcendence.
Yeah, diminishing the idea that there is anything meaningful beyond just this ordinary, immanent world.
And Reef identified one thing as like the quintessential death work of our time.
He did. Pornography.
Why pornography specifically?
Because he saw it as the ultimate expression of the anti-culture's logic.
Yeah.
It completely detaches sex from any context beyond immediate physical gratification.
Meaning separated from.
Separated from relationship, from love, from procreation, from any sense of sacredness or even long-term commitment. It reduces the act to pure, contextless sensation, which aligns perfectly with the therapeutic culture's focus on the expressive, feeling self, seeking immediate satisfaction.
It strips away all the older meanings and prohibitions.
Exactly. And this whole process, the anti-culture, the iconoclasm, the death works Reef, says it leads to a profound cultural condition, forgetfulness, a kind of willful amnesia about the past, about the sources of order. He even called it a new form of barbarism.
Barbarism through forgetting.
Yes, a ruthless forgetting of the authority and wisdom of what came before. And to bring it back to an earlier point, he saw abortion as particularly symbolic of this.
How so? As a death work.
Yes, as a death work that performs this forgetting in multiple ways. First, by treating potential human life, something previously held sacred, as disposable, profaning a sacred.
Okay.
And second, by allowing, in a way, the physical consequences of the sexual act pregnancy to be erased, facilitating that separation of sex from its procreative context that pornography also performs. It's anti-religious in its deepest impulse, according to Reef.
Okay, so pulling these threads together, in insights from Reef, Taylor, McIntyre, They all seem to point in a similar direction.
They do.
The things we see around us, this intense focus on psychological identity, the drive for expressive individualism, the way ethical arguments often seem to boil down to feelings, this constant chipping away at tradition. You're saying it all stems from this fundamental shift, this abandonment of a transcendent framework.
That's the core diagnosis these thinkers offer, yes. It all flows from replacing that external sacred anchor with the internal subjective authority of the individual self and its feelings, its psychological needs.
So the culture wars we hear so much about, it's not just disagreement over policy details.
No, it's much deeper than that. It's a fundamental breakdown in communication. You have different groups operating within entirely different frameworks, what Reef might call Second World remnants versus the dominant Third World therapeutic culture. McIntyre would say they use incommensurable moral languages.
Meaning they can't even really understand each other? They don't share the same basic assumptions or authorities?
Pretty much. They acknowledge no common ground, no shared authority to appeal to.
Which leaves us with a really challenging final thought, doesn't it? For you, the listener, to consider. If the ultimate basis for deciding what's right, who counts as a person, how society should be ordered, if all that gets reduced to just subjective preference, individual psychology, immediate happiness, then what authority is actually left? What common ground remains to solve any deep conflict or disagreement in society?
If there's no shared frame, no agreement on the telos, the purpose, how do we agree on what is truly good?
A profound question indeed. Something to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We'll see you next time.